Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on to launch the Russian translation of the Methane Regulatory Roadmap and Toolkit. I'd like to ask everyone to please put yourself on mute unless it's your turn to speak. And with that, we will start with some opening remarks from Tim Gould, our Chief Energy Economist, and then have a brief presentation from the IEA of the roadmap before we turn to the panel speakers. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Casey, and welcome everyone to this workshop on driving down methane emissions from fossil fuel operations in Central Asia. And my name's Tim Gould. I am the Chief Energy Economist at the International Energy Agency. And I'm particularly happy to be talking at this webinar today. Once upon a time, when I joined the International Energy Agency, I was a specialist on sort of Eurasian energy, and I focused in particular on Caspian and Central Asian issues. So I continue to follow that as closely as I can. And I do believe that the topic of today's webinar is strategic for the outlook for this region. So I'm very glad that we are making available this Russian translation of the IEA's Methane Regulatory Roadmap and Toolkit. You'll be hearing more about that very shortly. And before we get there, just a few introductory points. I think it's true that methane emissions do not always get the attention that they deserve in the discussion on climate change. But let there be no mistake, methane makes a major contribution to global warming. It's a much more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. So we need early action on methane emissions as a critical companion to our action on CO2. And this importance of the methane agenda has been on our radar at the IEA for many years. And now with the new global methane pledge, and also with this remarkable tightness that we have in global gas markets, and there's really a strong urgency around this issue. Because tackling methane, we can look at it as an economic, the economic drivers are strong. The environmental drivers, I think, are unarguable. But now we can also view this through an energy security lens, bringing additional gas to energy markets. This is gas that is currently being produced, but doesn't reach a productive use because it escapes to the atmosphere. And we've explored this in a recent report that we released just a few days ago, looking how at the energy security case for strong action on methane abatement and curtailing flaring. In our view, more than 200 billion cubic meters of gas, of additional gas, could be brought to markets if we took some common sense measures that have been proven to bring down flaring, non-emergency flaring, and curtailing methane leaks as well. A few months ago, energy ministers from nearly all of our member countries met together in Paris with representatives also from key partner countries around the world. And they agreed to send a strong signal on the need for these early and sustained reductions in energy-related methane emissions. And they strongly endorsed the work that we've been doing at the IEA on methane-related data and on the policy and regulatory advice that we provide. And for us in our thinking at IEA, this is really a critical part of how we move to a safer and more sustainable energy system in the future. And one of the instruments that we use, one of the tools that we provide for this debate is our expanded global methane tracker, which we updated most recently in February of this year. And I think it's true that efforts to reduce methane emissions have sometimes been held back by a lack of reliable data. There's a major scientific effort underway now to improve our understanding of methane emissions. There's a lot of new studies coming out, new measurement campaigns, and satellite data and other aerial observations are making this a very dynamic area. And the estimates, the country by country estimates that you can find in our methane tracker, they incorporate all of the new insights that we're getting from that science work. So we've collaborated closely with the world's methane science community to get a better understanding of emissions. Much more still needs to be done. But I think the key point here is that even as we improve our understanding of the data, that uncertainty over emissions levels is no reason to delay action, because we know how to bring emissions down. We don't need big new technological breakthroughs. In the oil and gas sector, companies can take action today to bring down emissions quickly with existing technologies and industry best practices. And in parallel, governments can use tried and tested approaches to encourage or require companies to establish leak detection and repair programs and upgrade leaky equipment and components. And so for us, there is no kind of acceptable level of methane emissions. Our aim should be to bring these down to as close to zero as possible. And I think the other thing that's very clear from looking at the way that this debate is evolving is that transparency is coming. If you do not manage your oil and gas sector well, it will be visible. It will be visible to the people who also buy your gas in other countries. So I think it's an incredibly important thing for us to have in mind as a component of the responsible development of the industry. And the task ahead of us is implementation. We are not just bringing data to the table. What we are trying to do is provide all of the information that we can on the practical steps that governments and industry can take. And that's where this methane regulatory roadmap and toolkit comes in. It's really that detailed how-to guide for policymakers and regulators seeking to cut emissions. And the report that we're making available to you today, it walks you through the different steps that can be taken on policy development and the various tools and regulatory measures that jurisdictions can take to address methane emissions. We very much hope that these tools can be as use for stakeholders in Central Asia. And we are impressed with the growing commitment that we see from some countries in the region to act on methane. Uzbekistan recently joining the Global Methane Pledge. And I think Kazakhstan is also a very good example of how it is possible to reduce the volumes of gas that have been flared and the flaring intensity in recent years. So we have some positive momentum. We need to maintain that. And I think the experience of countries and companies that have taken action is that it can be done quickly, it can be done very effectively, and it can be done very cost efficiently as well. I'm delighted that we have representatives from both Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan here for our panel, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing the perspectives of our discussants today about the priority areas for action in Central Asia and the exchange of experience that we can have on implementation. And I would just like to conclude by assuring you that the IEA remains very committed to support these efforts and as part of our discussion with you on sound energy policy and the move towards a safer and more sustainable energy system. Many, many thanks for your attention, and I'll hand the floor back to Casey Michaels.
Thank you, Tim. And with this, we will now do a brief presentation of the IEA's work on methane, including the Regulatory Roadmap and Toolkit. And I'll hand it over to my colleague Thomas to begin with this. And just to note, I added some links to the chat so you can find access to the current roadmap in English. And we will shortly publish the Russian translation. It will be available on the event page later today. Thomas?
Thank you, Casey, and thank you all for joining us today. You should already be seeing our slides on the screen. And I'd just like to give a bit more detail on what Tim was mentioning. We have been looking at this issue for a number of years now, because it's such a major opportunity for clean energy transitions. You know, the energy security angle, the clean angle, and so there are four key publications that we have launched recently. As Tim was mentioning, just last week, we released the energy security case for tackling gas flaring and methane leaks. And it highlights that rapid action to reduce flaring and methane emissions would have the same effect on the global temperature rise by mid-century as immediately eliminating all greenhouse gas emissions from the road transport sector. So in other words, this would have the same effect as moving all the world's cars, trucks, buses, and 2- and 3-wheelers to net zero emissions. And it also shows that if countries that currently export natural gas to the European Union were to implement these 2 measures, they could increase gas exports by more than 45 billion cubic meters using existing infrastructure. This is equivalent to almost 1/3 of Russian gas exports to the European Union last year. The second publication I'd like to mention is the Global Methane Tracker. This provides a set of country-level estimates for all sources of methane emissions from the energy sector. And alongside these estimates, we provide insights for action on methane, including a detailed view of the costs and abatement potentials of different measures that can be applied to the oil and gas sector. And this year, we also introduced a policy explorer that highlights how countries are taking regulatory action to reduce methane emissions. Also, last year, in the lead up to COP26, the IEA released curtailing methane emissions from fossil fuel operations. And this discusses how actors committed to strong action on methane can tread a path that is aligned with our net zero emissions by 2050 scenario. And this includes both measures aimed at reducing emissions from local industry and also ways to encourage abatement throughout international supply chains. And earlier in 2021, we published the Regulatory Roadmap and Toolkit on driving down methane leaks from the oil and gas industry. You will be hearing much more about this from Casey later on. And this is now available in Russian. It will be posted in the events page. But before we go to that, let me just give a little bit more of context on the need for further action on methane abatement and why is this such a big opportunity. While it is important to tackle all sources of methane emissions arising from human activity, there are a number of reasons to focus on emissions from fossil fuel operations. And one of the key ones is the clear potential to reduce them cost effectively. Methane is the main component of natural gas. It has a commercial value, quite high value at the moment. And in these sectors, avoided emissions can often be monetized directly, meaning that emissions reductions can generate economic savings or at least be carried out at a very low cost. And as you can see here in this chart, emissions from fossil fuel operations have been rising for the past 20 years, with the exceptional drop in 2020, which was linked with the large reduction in fossil fuel production. But as fuel production and demand rebounded from the shock of the pandemic in 2021, so too did methane emissions, and we estimate that energy-related methane emissions increased by almost 5% last year. Now, this leaves emissions slightly below where they were in 2019, even though overall energy demand and fossil fuel production are both back above pre-crisis levels. So this is a bit of a silver lining. This indicates that methane action on methane is happening, but it is happening on a very, very slow pace. And that methane keeps being wasted at such a large scale is really striking given today's backdrop of very tight and volatile gas markets. Fossil leaks, if captured and marketed, would have made about 180 billion cubic meters of gas available to the market. And when you add in flaring, you can get to the figure that Tim was mentioning previously, above 200 billion cubic meters of gas. Now, in 2021, as you can see, emissions are really far off the pathway set out in the IEA's net zero emissions by 2050 roadmap. And this roadmap, it gives the world an even chance of limiting the rise in global temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And in it, we see that methane emissions from oil, gas, and coal operations, they fall by 75% within this decade. And a key message here is that reducing fuel demand alone would not do the job quickly or effectively enough. We really need early and concerted abatement efforts by governments and by the industry to drive down emissions. And in this net zero scenario, by 2030, all fossil fuel producers would essentially reduce their emissions intensities down towards the level of the world's best operators today. And methane emissions have a very important near-term effect on climate, and they account for about 30% of the global rise in temperatures to date. The latest monitoring data shows the concentration of methane in the atmosphere is currently over 2.5 times greater than pre-industrial levels, and it is increasing steadily. When we look at the Caspian region, we see that energy-related emissions form the bulk of methane emissions in the region. Oil and gas operations accounted for about 8 million tons. That's close to 70% of the total. Coal mines emitted almost 1 million tons. And together, these two represent close to 14 billion cubic meters of gas that ended up in the atmosphere and went to waste instead of being put to use in energy systems. Another 4 BCM was sent to flares in the region. And as Tim pointed out, our estimates from emissions from the energy sector are based on the latest available scientific studies, measurement campaigns, and including increasing evidence from satellite observations. And indeed, advances in monitoring technologies, and especially satellites, have been boosting our understanding of the level and nature of methane emissions. And you can see here very large leaks from oil and gas operations were detected by satellites in 15 countries last year, with significant emissions coming from the Permian Basin in the United States, but also from parts of Central Asia. Turkmenistan alone was responsible for about 1/3 of the very large emissions events related to oil and gas seen by satellites in 2021. And you can see that satellites also reveal information on leaks from coal mines and waste in agriculture, as you see close to the region in China and India. Now, just because no leaks are seen in certain areas, that does not mean they are not occurring. Satellites struggle to provide readings in many environments, including offshore areas, mountain ranges, snowy or ice-covered regions, and also at high latitudes. And they are limited by cloud cover. So even if only a portion of the monitored area is clouded, only a small number of days detections will be able to be made. So a thorough picture of methane emissions based on satellites, but also on other monitoring technologies, will be fundamental to support methane mitigation efforts. It will facilitate the work of regulators in verifying compliance and also help track progress against reduction targets. And this is something that is evolving quite quickly, and there are a number of satellites that are targeted at methane emissions that were launched this year, and a few others that will be launched in the coming years that should improve a lot the state of information on methane emissions. As you can see here on this chart, a large share of the leaks that occur today in the oil and gas sector could be eliminated at no net cost, based on the price that we saw in recent years. In the last 5 years, more than half of the leaks occurring in the region and the Caspian region's oil and gas industry could be stopped while saving money. And this is because the cost of deploying the abatement technology or measure is less than the value of the methane, which again is just natural gas that is not leaked and can then be sold. But of course, gas prices have been much higher than these recent annual averages. And based on recent elevated natural gas prices, nearly all options that you see here to reduce emissions could be deployed while saving money. If all avoidable methane emissions that occurred during last year in the Caspian region were brought to markets today, revenues would amount to about $4 billion. Meanwhile, the annual spending necessary to implement these measures is much lower. It's only about $500 million. So because methane is such a potent greenhouse gas, and because leaks can be avoided at such low or negative costs, tackling methane emissions is one of the most cost-effective ways to act on climate change. And it's one of the 4 key measures that we have identified that are needed over the next 10 years to get the world onto a 1.5 degrees trajectory. And to do that, we will need strong action from all stakeholders, from industry, from citizens, from banks, from investors, and first and foremost from policymakers and regulators. Over to you, KC, for a discussion on how governments can drive down methane emissions.
Thank you, Thomas. So Thomas has just presented data from our global methane tracker, which helps to delineate the problem of methane emissions and where those emissions lie. And in parallel, we've developed a step-by-step guide on what policymakers and regulators can do about the problem. So to develop this guide, we started by undertaking a broad survey of existing methane regulations and policies across the globe. The results of this survey are found in the IEA's policies database, which we've been working to expand and update ever since we released the roadmap. So the tables here on this slide show a snapshot of the different types of policies that exist, categorized among 4 main regulatory approaches. This includes prescriptive or command and control requirements, performance-based requirements, economic instruments, and information-based instruments. And this year in 2022, for the first time, we've integrated this policy database into the global methane tracker. So the tracker now includes a policy explorer tool that provides a snapshot of the different policies in place for 25 major oil and gas producing jurisdictions. And so looking at these tables, as you can see, although there are some visible gaps in many countries, most jurisdictions, or essentially all jurisdictions, already have some requirements in place that can affect or improve or reduce methane emissions. This means that most countries already have building blocks that can serve as a foundation for new or updated regulatory or policy actions. And it also means that there's a lot of experience out there already among different countries, and policymakers can look to each other's experience for inspiration and best practices. From this broad survey of existing policies and regulations, we've developed a step-by-step guide for policymakers that are looking to develop new or updated methane regulations. This is our methane roadmap and toolkit that we have now made available, translated into several languages, including French, Spanish, Arabic, and today Russian, with Portuguese coming later this year. So what's in the roadmap? The roadmap outlines the process for implementation of a new regulation or updated regulation, which unfolds in 3 distinct phases that you can see depicted here in this chart. Information gathering, followed by defining, developing, and drafting a regulatory proposal, and then a focus on implementation, which includes measures on compliance and processes to review and adapt policies over time. Although we've presented them sequentially here, in many places, these steps may take place in different order and may overlap. So for each of these steps in the roadmap, we go through the different key decision points and walk through a series of questions that are designed to aid policymakers in collecting the information they need and also selecting and designing a regulatory approach that matches the local circumstances. The second component of our guide is the regulatory toolkit. This describes the various policy and regulatory tools that jurisdictions can use to address methane emissions. We've divided these tools into 3 different categories, and for each category, we provide definitions, discuss the different advantages and disadvantages, and highlight a number of examples drawn from our survey. So the first category introduces the many ways through which a methane requirement can be put in place. Broader laws such as energy reform acts or climate change laws often include methane-specific provisions, which can also present an opportunity to include this topic in any ongoing policy efforts that are broader than methane. Alternatively, a regulation that is more specific to the theme of methane can propose a comprehensive control strategy, or using a case-by-case process, permitting agencies can include methane measures as a condition in new permits and licenses. The second category discusses the 4 main regulatory approaches mentioned earlier. Prescriptive requirements, the first category, are things like simply outlawing routine flaring and venting. These are often an easy way to start if particular abatement opportunities have been defined. This includes things like leak detection and repair as well. Performance-based or outcome-based regulations, such as methane intensity standards or reduction targets and goals, typically require a better understanding of emissions baselines and mitigation options, but they ensure key objectives can be achieved over time as they set a specific target that must be reached. Economic instruments include things like taxes and also grants and finance provisions. And these tend to provide more flexibility for the industry and a cost-effective path forward. But at the same time, they tend to require a more structured and robust monitoring system. And the fourth category, information-based regulations, include things like measurement and reporting frameworks. And these can be a good option if a better understanding of methane emissions is needed and can serve as a basis for other types of regulations. And lastly, just to note that many regulatory environments combine different approaches to reach the optimal arrangement. So in very few countries will you find only one of these types of instruments. There are typically a mix of different types, including both information as well as prescriptive and performance and also economic. The third and final category in the regulatory toolkit explores a number of what we call essential policy elements or essential program elements. These include things like monitoring, reporting and verification, and coordination mechanisms that typically are included in essentially any regulatory scheme. Now, before we turn to the panel discussion, I wanted to say a few words about the target audience for this roadmap to provide a little bit more of our thinking in terms of who we aim this at. So first, one of the most important audiences is actually the industry itself. And here we see many different uses for the roadmap from the industry perspective. In our view, ultimately, it is the industry that will be implementing and complying with any policies or regulations that come from governments. So first, our regulatory toolkit can help to orient those industry players to the different types of regulations that they may see in their operating environments over time around the world. Second, many of the policy tools direct companies to undertake specific practices. For example, leak detection and repair requirements essentially mandate companies to undertake campaigns of detection followed by making prompt repairs. And of course, companies can undertake these measures voluntarily, which can then prepare them in the event that legal requirements are put in place later. And also, companies tend to have a direct and significant influence as policies are developed. And thus, companies that lead the effort with voluntary action can show policymakers what is possible and also potentially lead the way for other companies. But looking beyond industry, of course, our primary target audience is policymakers and regulators that are looking to learn from the experience of counterparts around the world. And throughout the roadmap, we reference many examples from our survey of different policy instruments. And we include links to many of those entries from our policies database so that policymakers can look for inspiration to other countries to look at approaches that have already been proven, tried and tested approaches working in other countries already. But in addition to this, we are also working with in addition to the roadmap in general, we're also working with our partners in the Methane Guiding Principles Initiative to develop what we're calling an oil and gas sector toolkit to support countries that have joined the Global Methane Pledge. And we do hope to release this new tool in mid-July. And the focus of that toolkit will be to bring together the different resources and sources of support into one place to help policymakers orient themselves to the landscape of international support. And it's our hope that together, tools like our regulatory roadmap and the MGP toolkit just mentioned can be important resources for policymakers as they draft and implement national methane action plans and new methane policies in the coming months. And with this, we're happy to turn to the panelists. I would just note that we do have a chat and Q&A function, so please enter any questions you have for us or for the panelists as we go forward into the chat and Q&A. We'll try to answer some of them live, but we'll also make sure that we answer via the chat function if that works as well. So I'm happy now to turn it over to Imgul, who will moderate the panel discussion.
Thank you very much. Hello, Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Ain Kulkelimrai, country expert at the EU for Energy program. I'm very excited to be here, and I would like to thank International Energy Agency for organizing this event and for publishing very useful report on which guides on how to reduce emissions, methane emissions. Central Asian countries, all of them actually joined Paris Agreement, and most of them submitted national determined contributions to reduce greenhouse gases emissions. And we have seen today, as outlined by Tomasz, that energy sector represents large share of methane emissions in the region. And there is still potential to reduce methane emissions in the region. In that regard, roadmap, which was published by the International Energy Agency, can provide useful instrument for the policymakers to learn from the experience of other countries and adopt effective policy instruments to reduce methane emissions. First of all, I will introduce our participants of panel discussion today, and then I will give the floor to each one of them and ask to share their experiences and what governments and industries have been doing to reduce methane emissions. So we have the representative of the Ministry of Ecology, Geology and Natural Resources of the Republic of Kazakhstan today, represented by Janat Ingirbayeva. She is a chief expert at the Low Carbon Development Unit, Department of Climate Change and Green Technologies. We have also together with us Ministry of Energy of the Republic of Kazakhstan, which is represented by Dauren Abulkhairov. He is a deputy director of the Department of Gas and Petroleum Chemistry. Ministry of Energy currently is responsible for oil and gas sector, for policy making in this sector. We have representative of Ministry of Energy of the Republic of Uzbekistan, Farukh Kalimov. He is a chief specialist of the Foreign Economic Relations Department in the Ministry of Energy of the Republic of Uzbekistan. I'm happy to have also here representatives of the industry sectors. Daniela Contu, she's the head of Nature Conservation Strategy and GHG Management at the ENI SPA. ENI is an Italian multinational oil and gas company headquartered in Rome. And we have also representative from the World Bank, Martin Oswald. He's a senior gas specialist. Martin joined the World Bank as a senior gas specialist in Dakar, Senegal office in 2021, after having worked for Shell in various up and midstream business development and economics functions for more than 15 years in Asia, Europe, and Africa. His academic background covers international economics, energy policy, and law from the Johns Hopkins University, Sciences Po Paris, and University of Vienna. His past speaking engagements include organizations such as European Commission, Morgan Stanley, and the Asian Energy Sector Roundtable. So now I would like to give the floor to Janat Ingirbayeva from the Ministry of Ecology, Geology, and Natural Resources of the Republic of Kazakhstan to share what was the activities of the Ministry of Ecology in Kazakhstan in regulating methane emissions. Janat, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Добрый день, уважаемые участники сегодняшней встречи.
Good morning. I would like to welcome all of you on behalf of the Ministry of Geology and Natural Resources of the Republic of Kazakhstan. I would like to thank all speakers and IA for organizing this event. As you well know, Kazakhstan ratified Paris Agreement, and we have taken the commitment on reducing methane emissions by 15% by 2030. And also we've taken the commitment of carbon neutrality by 2060. According to national legislation, methane is included in the list of pollutants, and it requires environmental permits. There are special rates for emissions, both from the stationary facilities and for the flaring of natural gas or secondary gas. And we are tracking methane as part of the annual inventory of greenhouse emissions. According to the data in 2020, the methane emissions were equal to 1,472,000 tons, which is 43 million CO2 equivalent. And so this is 15% of all emissions of greenhouse gas in Kazakhstan. The biggest contribution of methane comes from energy sector, about 30%, agriculture, 53%, the waste sector, 16%, land use, and industrial process, 0.4%. Also, we are undertaking steps to join global initiative on climate and gas. The international companies and leaders on oil and gas are part of this initiative, who produce about 30% of gas globally. The goal of the initiative is to reduce the emissions of 20 tons per barrel of oil by 2020 of CO2 equivalent. And part of this initiative, we're also planning a number of measures to organize seminars for oil and gas companies on reporting, qualitative assessment, and reduction of methane emissions. Also organizing campaigns on satellite monitoring as part of this, and setting the baseline for methane emissions in the oil and gas sector of Kazakhstan. Also, Kazakhstan is planning to take the global pledge on methane emissions, and in future we're planning to bring methane emissions to zero after the leak repairing measures and carbon capturing methodologies. Thank you. Thank you very much, Renat. We will have questions after all participants will make their presentations. Abukhairov Davlen is next speaker, Deputy Director of Gas and Oil and Chemistry in the Ministry of Energy, Republic of Kazakhstan. Please, the floor is yours. This is the same in Kazakh language, the presentation. Please.
Энергетика министрлігінің газ саласында осы метанды азайту бойынша жүргізген жұмыстар туралы қысқаша айтып өтуге рұқсат етіңіздер. Мұнай және газ конденсатты кен орындарын барлау және пайдалану процесінде ластанудың негізгі көздерінің бірі газды алау етіп жағудан алынатын өнімдер болып табылады. Осыған байланысты елдің мұнай газ кен орындарында газды соңғы жылдары мемлекеттік мәнге
The speaker is speaking Kazakh language, and we are waiting for interpretation from Kazakh language.
Естіп тұр ма?
Дәурен Тұрғанбайұлы, естілмей тұр.
You're waiting for interpretation from Kazakh language into English into or Russian, so we could interpret into the other language.
I think we can proceed.
Естілмей тұр, Дәурен Тұрғанбайұлы. Естілмей тұр сіздің сөздеріңіз. I think we should proceed with the next presentation. Maybe representative Minister of Energy can join us later once the connection problems will be resolved. Now I'd like to pass the floor to Farukh Halimov. He's a chief specialist of the foreign economic relations at the Ministry of Energy of the Republic of Uzbekistan. Farukh, the floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Farukh Halimov. I am from the Ministry of Energy of Uzbekistan. During the 26th session of the Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, an international initiative on the Global Methane Pledge was put forward. In May 2022, as it was told, within the framework of the first International Forum on Poverty Reduction, ceremonial event was held dedicated to accession of Uzbekistan to initiative of the global commitment to reduce methane emissions. Uzbekistan agrees to take voluntary action to contribute to a collective effort to reduce global methane emissions by 2030 by at least 30% from 2020 levels. We know that methane is the second most abundant substance in the atmosphere after carbon dioxide, which contributes to temperature rise. Methane traps 80 times more heat in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide. In turn, Uzbekistan contributes to the international efforts to combat global warming by joining this initiative. We have political commitment of transition to a green economy and reduce methane emissions. In particular, the importance of joining Uzbekistan to the initiative of global commitment to reduce methane, taking into account the impact of methane emissions on climate. We have to achieve the goals of this initiative. Comprehensive actions will be taken in Uzbekistan, focusing on energy sector, based on close cooperation with international partners, including International Energy Agency. Thank you.
Thank you, Farukh. Now I'd like to give the floor to Daniela Conto from any SPA. Daniela, the floor is yours.
Thanks and good morning to everyone. I'm Daniela Conto, and as you said, I work in INAI in climate change and strategy and positioning unit. During this presentation, I will give you a quick overview on principal partnership and collaboration in which ENI is involved, and some activities that, like ENI, we are putting in place in our fields. Thanks. As you know, ENI considers natural gas as a fundamental energy source in the transition towards a low carbon energy mix. And we are really very convinced that the role of transition fuel must also be preserved through adequate management and minimization of methane emissions. The issue now has become central in the climate debate, also thanks to the launch during the COP26 of the Global Methane Pledge, which today already got the support of more than 100 countries. ENI has been committed to reduce methane emissions for many years, and having been one of the first companies since 2015 to define a target for the absolute reduction of fugitive methane emissions. And as probably you know, we also participate in the main international partnership on methane, and we have supported in recent months the definition of the European methane strategy by actively participating in the various international tables that have dealt with this issue. Just quickly, within OGCI, ENI participates in the collective target on reducing methane emission intensity well below 0.2% at 2025, and together with other members launched the Aiming for Near Zero Methane Emission Initiative. That means calling for an all-in approach that treats methane emissions as seriously as the oil and gas industry already treats safety. Signing this framework, we will strive to reach near zero methane emissions from our operated oil and gas assets by 2030. And we will encourage our partners to achieve similar results. This commitment also requires to put in place all reasonable actions to avoid methane emissions, to repair detected leaks, report annually and transparently on our methane emissions, and also supplement methane emissions estimates with more monitoring and measurement technology. And finally, report and verification of mechanisms, with the implementation of strong regulations to tackle methane emissions, encouraging also governments to include methane emissions reduction targets as part of their climate strategy. OGCI, is also committed to develop and test projects of new technologies, as well as investing in startups through OGCI-CI. Regarding OGMP, our collaboration in oil and gas methane partnership, OGMP is an initiative promoted by the United Nations, which also sees the participation of the European Commission. ENI here is committed to achieve a gold standard level in the monitoring and reporting of methane emissions, as in the framework, in the dedicated framework of OGMP. And finally, I will mention a public-private initiative, the Methane Guidance Principle, as ENI is committed to respect 5 key principles in management of methane emissions. In 2021, as part of the Methane Guidance Principle Working Group, ENI, together with okay, I will answer after if it's not a problem, okay? As part of Methane Guidance Principle Working Group, ENI, together with other international companies in the sector, And some of the major organizations in academic and non-profit world has shared with the European Commission, a series of documents. And the main recommendation provided is as a support to the implementation of a robust and homogeneous reporting and verification system with possibly a progressive and growing penetration of the use of direct measurement technologies, clear rules, requirement for the adoption of leak detection and repair practices. Moreover, we are supporting our initiative led by UNEP, like the Global Methane Alliance, aimed at engaging with governments in order to include methane reduction targets within specific countries' objective. We really and strongly believe that voluntary actions taken by the industry, complemented with a robust regulation, are crucial for accelerating the methane reduction trajectory and enabling a faster development of the technologies necessary for ensuring an effective methane emission monitoring and mitigations. These actions can be more and more effective if the industry acts collectively through the collaboration with partnerships and with initiatives like, as I mentioned, OGCI, OGMP, and MGP. And to provide a regional example of a successful story, through OGCI, we started recently a proactive dialogue with the Kazakhstan government, offering our technical support and expertise in order to help the country to properly manage methane emissions. With the support of the local low carbon working group, the subject and subject to expression of interest of the Kazakh minister, we are working for delivering several activities, including organization of a dedicated workshop with the local authorities and also, of course, oil and gas producers on the specific topic on the methane emissions quantification and reduction. We are also organizing measurement campaigns on selected OGCI and non-OGCI assets. And we are support the development of a national baseline on methane emissions. Okay, next please. And now a quick overview on E&I main activity on each specific emission component that contributes to methane emissions. Regarding flaring, we can reduce this contribution, first of all, with flaring down projects. We also are working. Yes, of course, it's possible. We also are working to marketing scouting on technology to quantify the unburnt gas at the flares. Moreover, we are performing a technical feasibility study for the development of closed flare, both in our greenfield, but also in our brownfield, if it will be possible. Regarding stationary combustion, we perform energy assessment to evaluate all possible opportunities in brownfield assets, such as operational optimization, maintenance management, application of best available technologies. And finally, electrification and integration with renewable energy. Regarding venting, while we are trying to complete our venting sources mapping, especially including whole cold flare and well venting, we emphasize zero venting on all our greenfield assets, and we are hard working on mitigation projects on brownfield. And finally, a few words on fugitives, because a systematic monitoring and mapping of emissions conducted in our asset, and we are covering more than 96% of ENI's operated production. These more traditional techniques have recently been joined by new technologies for detecting and estimating emissions, which involve the use of portable systems, satellites, airplanes, drones, and fixed locations. The different platform, perhaps you know, can use jointly in order to exploit the possible synergies, overcoming the relative limits. In fact, systems such as airplanes and satellites are capable of rapidly cover large areas, but they have important detection limits, while more accurate technologies, both for the localization of emissions and for the low detection threshold, can only be used at plant scale. In order to reduce fugitive emissions at the basis, we discovered also special valves that are an innovative technology which prevents the fugitive emissions. And we have validated these valves also in our plants. To date, the valves have maintained the required performance standards, so they are working well. So this is my presentation. I don't know when I can answer to the questions. Tell me which is the.
Thank you very much, Daniela. Yeah, we will have Q&A sessions after all presentations. It's very encouraging to hear the industry-led initiatives and the work that ENI do with in Kazakhstan particularly, and the collaboration with Kazakh government. This is very encouraging. So our next speaker is the representative of the World Bank. We have also our representative from the Ministry of Energy joined back, and we will have the presentation of Ministry of Energy after the intervention from the Martin Oswald, Senior Gas Specialist, World Bank. Martin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And also thank you to IEA for this great invitation to this event. As said, my name is Martin Oswald, and I represent the World Bank's Global Gas Flaring Reduction Partnership. And why am I here today? Well, I'm representing the flaring partnership, and we talk about methane. So the venting of methane is very much also within our mandate. And of course, that is thematically very tightly connected to what we're discussing today. So we've recently concluded a major study of 28 case studies across the world, all major oil producing and gas producing countries, where we look at their flaring, venting, and where also available fugitive methane regulation. And many of the findings that do apply, in particular to flaring and venting, are also applicable, as we found out, to fugitive methane. And we wanted to share those with you, the key ones at least. So what are those findings? First and foremost, material monetary sanctions do make a difference. So at the various studies we looked at, those countries who tightened the financial screws did achieve great results, at the very least with regards to flaring reduction. And that, for the time being, is the type of oil and gas emission that can be best measured. For example, we do it with heat imagery from satellites across the globe. Following the material monetary sanctions, what's another finding that we had? That regulations are only as good as the enforcement or the capability of the enforcement agency. And what do I mean with that is, first and foremost, the enforcement agency needs to be properly resourced. needs to be properly trained, and its mandate needs to be in line with the regulatory requirements. Third finding, an integrated gas value chain is of the essence. Why is that? Because you can be as strict and as good as enforcer as you want to. If the operators don't have anywhere to put their gas, then they will still flare it, vent it, or get rid of it otherwise. So an integrated value chain where your upstream is has a midstream connection and of course then further down the roads, a downstream outlet is key to make it as easy as possible for the operators to find alternative use for their gas and not flare it, vent it, or otherwise. Now, I also wanted to give you a couple of country examples where we found that our key findings were very well implemented and where, as mentioned before, at least from a flaring perspective, we could see really remarkable improvements. Starting with Norway, which is clearly leading the charts. They managed to bring down their flaring emissions and to the extent that it can be measured, also the other emissions, to a really remarkably low level. But it should also be said that Norway has had a very long tradition in terms of environment, in terms of emissions abatement. And they started in the 1970s. And what they are doing, so in principle, they are fulfilling all the three key findings that I just presented, but I wanted to elaborate more on the material monetary sanctions that they have in place. Because what Norway has done is they have introduced them on multiple levels. So for example, they have a CO2 tax, they have an emission trading scheme, and they have a permit system in place where you need to apply to be allowed to flare. And what these multiple layers allow the regulator is to tighten the screws on various levels and to fine-tune their system. Because one thing that we also found out is you will not get it right from the very beginning. You have to build in the sort of wiggle room on the regulatory side that you can work with the private sector, with your operators, and develop a system that works for everyone and tighten the screws in a productive way, if you will, so that you don't, in a way, destroy value for your industry, but at the same time, of course, achieve the results of reducing emissions. The second example that I wanted to mention from a country perspective is Colombia. They have been on a quite a long successful journey, and they have reduced their emissions from the oil and gas industry quite remarkably. But recently, I think it was in February 2022, they've landed quite a coup in the sense that they were one of the first countries to launch a regulation that covers fugitive methane. And what is quite remarkable about that is, of course, they were one of the first ones to launch something on fugitive methane, but they also combined fugitive methane with flaring and venting, which, of course, from a thematic perspective makes a lot of sense. It's one piece of regulation. It's also a kind of a one-stop regulatory shop for the operators that gives them regulatory certainty. So it was quite a remarkable step. And it is, by the way, also in line with what other major blocks currently have in a proposal stage. For example, if you look at the European Commission's proposal, but also at the US EPA's proposal, they all cover all three emission elements: flaring, venting, and fugitive methane in one piece of regulation, or proposed regulation, if we talk about the European Union and the US. So what else is there to say about Colombia other than them having a pioneering position and the fact that they really reduced their CO2 emissions remarkably? They also have a very strong national oil company, Ecopetrol, that has environmental protection as kind of part of their informal mission statements, and they were very strong in pushing these efforts together with the government. They introduced monetary penalties that were material enough to support these efforts and to convince the private sector to find productive solutions for their associated gas rather than flaring it or venting it. And of course, they had a very, and I've mentioned that before, a very strong government support to also create a local market for their gas, for the locally produced gas. And that brings me back to the third point that I mentioned before as one of our key findings, the integrated gas value chain. You have to make it as easy as possible for the private sector, for the oil and gas producers to utilize their gas and to restrain from measures such as flaring or venting. Third country example that I wanted to mention, and is an obvious one, is Kazakhstan. So we look at when we look at countries and when we compare them globally, we have two measures. One is the overall flare gas volume, and the other one is what we call the flaring intensity, which is the cubic meter of gas flared per barrel of oil produced, which arguably is a more objective measure. And what Kazakhstan achieved there is they reduced, in 2015, they were still flaring 6.12 cubic meters per barrel of oil produced. And in 2021, they managed to reduce that to 2.34. So almost a 2/3 reduction, which is quite remarkable. And which is also why we looked at Kazakhstan in a bit more detail to understand what happened. So one is that the government introduced a very decisive piece of regulation in the midst of the 2010s, which included monetary fines. That was very good. And on top of it, there was an attempt made to create a domestic gas market by kind of enabling a midstream downstream operator, Transgas, to purchase gas from upstream operators and to distribute it to the local markets. And that, of course, is another way of implementing an integrated gas value chain. In other words, give your upstream operators an outlet for your gas so that they have an alternative to flaring or venting it. So quite a remarkable achievement from Kazakhstan there. And what I would say in conclusion is that because flaring and venting regulation has been around since the early 2000s, and methane regulation, in particular fugitive methane regulation, is only gaining traction pretty much since the global methane pledge in COP26. We look at what IEA did a bit before, a year and a half before, but quite recent in any event. So given that flaring and venting regulation has been around for so long, there are a lot of elements that can be transferred and where regulators who are working on fugitive methane can learn from what has been done for flaring and venting, and we should take advantage of that. But of course, there's one key difference, and that is that measuring, in particular on a global scale of methane volumes, is still in its infancy. And that brings me back to a statement that Tim made in his opening statement. Just because we don't have a perfect data situation, that should not be an excuse for us to not do anything on methane. And I would like to leave it at that. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Martin. I'm very happy to hear, since I'm from Kazakhstan, that there was a significant progress in Kazakhstan in terms of reducing emissions from oil and gas. And this is also can be seen from inventory of emissions to UNFCCC, that fugitive emissions went significantly. I would like to give the floor to Ministry of Energy, Дәурен Абилхаиров. Дәурен Тұрғынбайұлы, сізге сөз береміз.
Саламатсыздар ма, құрметті әріптестер? Көрінеді ме? Техникалық ақауларға байланысты жаңа байланыстан ажыратылып қалдым.
I would like to start this presentation. Yes, dear interpreters, could you read the text in English that we have shared with you? Could we read it in English? Could you tell, please, that yes, we can, because probably the moderator will not hear us. Yes, we can read it out. Both channels will be interpreting and reading it out. Yeah, just tell them we can continue. The floor is yours. Can we do interpretation? Yes. Okay. One of the main sources of pollution of the process of exploration and operation of oil and gas condensate fields are products from gas flaring. In this regard, gas utilization of the country's oil and gas field has acquired national importance in the recent years and is one of the main tasks of subsoil users engaged in oil and gas operation within the country. In order to rationally use gas resources and reduce the environmental burden, the Ministry of Energy of Republic of Kazakhstan, together with interested state bodies with the support of the government of the Republic of Kazakhstan, has done a lot of work to improve and develop the legislative framework which has made it possible to increase the responsibility of subsoil users in the resolving gas utilization issues. In accordance with the Code on Subsoil and Subsoil Use, hereinafter referred to as Code, flaring of raw gas is prohibited except for the following cases. First, threats or emergencies, threats to the life of personnel or public health and the environment. Two, when testing well objects. Three, during trial operation of the deposits. Fourth, with technological inevitable combustion of raw gas. According to the paragraph 3 and the article 147 of the code, in order to rationally use raw gas and reduce the harmful impact on the environment, subsoil users are required to develop programs for development of the raw gas processing, which must be updated every 3 years. The raw gas
көмірсутек саласындағы уәкілетті органның бекітуіне жатады және олар әр 3 жыл сайын жаңартылуға
the volumes of gas production, processing, utilization, and flaring, which are developed with an involvement of domestic scientific institutions, research, design institutes. The main activities of the utilization of raw gas are preparation and sale of consumer gas to consumers, generation of electricity for heat supply of domestic and industrial facilities, and use of gas for technological purposes. It has the injection of gas into the reservoir for enhanced oil recovery, and in the gas lift method of oil production, as well as the use of gas for own needs for oil heating furnaces. Dynamics of volumes. Dynamics of volumes of utilized and flare gas in comparison with the oil and gas production by subsoil use of the reduction of Kazakhstan for 2006-2021 shown in the following table. Oil production in Kazakhstan, millions of tons. As you can see this on the screen. In addition, and in accordance with the current legislation of the operating production assets of the fields, all flare systems must be equipped with the gas flow meters. Gas measurement logs are kept daily, and control is carried out to prevent the excess of environmental emissions for combustion. Also, with the introduction of the new Environmental Code of the Republic of Kazakhstan dated July 1, 2021, hereinafter referred to as EC, the requirement of the Code of Administrative Offences for environmental offences, including gas flaring, were tightened. For example, for violation of the norms of permissible anthropogenic impact on the environment, which is Article 328 of the Code of Administrative Offences, the amount of penalties increased by the 10 times, for repeated violation within 3 years by 20 times. For non-compliance with the conditions of an environmental permit, Article 326, the amount of penalties increased from 50 to 300 MCI, monthly calculation index. If the offense is committed repeatedly within 3 years after the imposition of administrative penalty, the amount of the fine is increased from 150 to 1,000 MCI, and failure by legal entities to eliminate within the established period of violations for which the operation of the environmental permit has been suspended entails the deprivation of the environmental permit. Currently, the working group under the Majlis of the Republic of Kazakhstan in discussing is discussing the draft law of the Republic of Kazakhstan on amendments and additions to the certain legislative acts of the Republic of Kazakhstan on the promotion of innovation, the development of digitalization, and information security. In accordance with paragraph 127 of the schedule of the implementation of the national project, which is called Technological Breakthrough through Digitalization, Science, and Innovation, and transitional period is provided for equipping with metering devices until December 2023. There is still 2 paragraphs to go, but I think it's finished. One of the proposed amendments is the introduction of amendments and additions to Article 144 of the Code of Republic of Kazakhstan on subsoil and subsoil use, which provides additional equipment with metering devices for crude oil, gas condensate, sour gas, and products and processing. During production, processing, transportation of raw commercial gas with the determines and quantitative and qualitative characteristics, including during technological operations for the collection, preparation, injection into the reservoir, combustion. Further, the implementation of automated real-time collection, processing, storage, and use of data in the oil accounting information system. Currently, 25 producing fields, 4 transport oil pipelines, and 5 refineries are equipped with the metering devices. The main objective of measures for the utilization of raw gas is to ensure the most rational use of gas as a vulnerable natural resource. Subsoil users began to invest more in financial resources for environmental activities, and the issue of gas utilization became one of the main ones in the activities of companies.
I would like to thank Abdul Khairov for this presentation, and having this opportunity for being moderator, I would like to first ask the question to the Ministry of Ecology, Geology and Natural Resources, to Janat Ingirbayeva. I hope she's here.
Yes, she's here.
Janat, я бы хотела бы вас спросить.
Janat, I would like to ask you, to the best of my knowledge, Kazakhstan has the quota trading system for greenhouse gas emissions. And in fact, this is the only system of market regulation in Central Asia, which was launched back in 2013. And as far as I know, the CO2 is also, emissions are also regulated as part of this system. Are you planning to add methane as well in the regulation of the quota trading system, or is methane currently regulated as a pollutant as part of the environmental code for the activities available for the best available technologies, the so-called best available technologies? Could you share that with us, this? We can't hear you, Janat.
Не слышно. Не слышно, Жанат. Может быть, вы можете в чат написать, тогда мы...
We still cannot hear you, but maybe you can answer in the chat. I also would like to ask Ministry of Energy of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, Ministry of Energy, your representatives of government authorities. So could you please tell us, what are the barriers at this time to develop gas infrastructure? I know one of the barriers is the price of gas that does not stimulate processing and supplying gas for internal needs. Internal needs continue to grow, and how much price is the factor that facilitates or hinders gas processing.
Айымгүл, кешірім сұраймын, сіз өте жай айттыңыз да естілмеді. Шамалы қаттырақ айтасыз ба?
Газдың бағасы кедергі болып тұр ма? Газды ішкі маркетке, ішкі пайдалануға кедергі болып тұр ма газдың бағасы?
Сұрақты дұрыс түсінбедім. Газды пайдалану, газдың бағасы ішкі пайдалануға кедергі болып тұр ма дейсіз ба?
Вот получается цена природного газа.
The price of the natural gas is too low. Is it a barrier to stimulate processing and supplying processed gas or accompanying gas to direct it to local internal market to be used by consumers? At this time, this accompanying gas that is captured, is it supplied to local consumers?
Өндірілген газ, ілеспе газ, сіз айтып жатқан табиғи газ барлығы да зауыттарда өндіріліп, ішкі нарыққа толығымен қамтамасыз етіліп жатыр. Заң және Қазақстан Республикасының газ және газбен жабдықтау заңына сәйкес бірінші кезекте ішкі нарықта қамтамасыз етіледі, содан артылғаны ғана экспортқа шығарылады. Қазіргі таңда ішкі нарық толығымен қамтамасыз етіліп жатыр.
Yes, I now received. Спасибо большое.
Thank you very much.
The internal demand for gas is fully satisfied. We also have questions from the chat, particular question to Daniela, how OGMP2 and ETS are aligned. Does EU ETS recognize methane reduction efforts under OGMP2? Daniela?
Okay. As you know, ETS doesn't contain methane emissions in the regulations. What we can say anyway is that OGMP framework introduces very strong measurement rules. And so we think that the methane emissions could be discovered in a very strong way. As you know, probably we are now working in European regulations on framework on methane, and in this case, for sure, the European regulation will utilize the OGMP framework to tackle methane emissions.
Thank you very much, Daniela. I think we are running out of time, so currently, according to agenda, we have to finalize. And if there are some questions unanswered, maybe IEA could follow up and answer to that questions. So now I would like to pass the floor for closing remarks and next steps for Talia Watman. She's the Caspian and Black Sea Program Manager at the IEA.
Thank you very much, Aymgul. And thank you very much to all of our panelists for this excellent discussion and for sharing your experiences. At the moment, energy security is one of the most important topics, not only for Central Asia, but for all countries around the world. We've just published a short report on the energy security case for tackling gas flaring and methane leaks. And as Russia's invasion of Ukraine has roiled energy markets, seriously working to curtail flaring and methane leaks could result in nearly an extra 210 BCM of natural gas in the market. As was mentioned by my colleague Tim in the opening remarks, there's a huge opportunity here to bring down emissions and free up more gas only using existing technologies, policy levers, and best practice. We are very pleased to see that there is momentum in the region for tackling this important issue, not only for energy security, but of course also for reducing the impacts of climate change. We at the IEA are especially heartened to see that Uzbekistan has joined the Global Methane Pledge, and we are very pleased to hear that Kazakhstan is planning to join. The IEA is happy to provide support both for countries who have joined the pledge and for others who are considering joining. Good, reliable data remains key to taking action on reducing methane emissions from fossil fuel operations. We have been working closely with governments in Central Asia and the Caucasus through the EU for Energy program on improving energy data collection and dissemination, and we look to continue that work going forward. Do not hesitate to reach out to us so that we can better understand how to support your governments and your statistics offices to improve the reliability of this data, as well as to offer advice on practical steps that can be taken to address methane emissions. We hope that you find the roadmap and the toolkit useful, and we look forward to working with you to tackle this important issue. Thank you again to everyone for your participation and questions. And of course, thank you to our wonderful interpreters. And you will be able to find all of these slides on our website, so as well as the translation of the methane roadmap. Thank you.